Welcome to Amelia Kingsley. I'm so glad you could join us today. Now, let's dive right into the story.
Chapter 1. My husband brought his mistress to our son's graduation and put her in my seat. Not beside him. Not in the row behind. In the reserved family chair with my name printed on the card in gold foil, the one I had requested 8 months earlier when the school first sent the ceremony forms. I found out 22 minutes before the processional began. My sister-in-law, Donna, called from inside the auditorium. Her voice had the specific careful quality of someone delivering bad news they have been rehearsing since the parking lot. "Margaret," she said. "I think you need to know what's happening before you walk in." I was standing outside in the September heat, with a cream-colored blazer over my arm, and a bouquet of sunflowers for my son, Daniel, because sunflowers had always been his flower since he was 4 years old and insisted on planting them in a coffee can on our apartment balcony. I had driven 40 minutes. I had left work early. I had spent the previous evening writing Daniel a letter I planned to slip into his blazer pocket before the ceremony began. "Tell me," I said. Donna exhaled. "Marcus is here. He has a woman with him. She is sitting in the seat marked Margaret Hayes." I looked at the sunflowers in my hand. "She is wearing a red dress," Donna added, as though the color mattered. It did, actually. Red in an auditorium full of navy and charcoal said something about a woman's understanding of the room she was entering. I did not ask who the woman was. I already knew. I had known her name for 6 months. I had known the approximate address of the apartment Marcus kept for her in the River District for 5 months. I had known the private phone number he used to call her, the credit card he used to pay for her dinners, the hotel in Charleston, where he had taken her the same weekend he told me he had a conference. Her name was Priya Hals. She was 31. Marcus was 54. I was 52. I had been married to Marcus Hayes for 26 years. "Where am I supposed to sit?" I asked. Not because I didn't know. Because I wanted to hear Donna say it. "He has you listed as extended family," she said quietly. "You have a seat in the general section. Row J. Row J." I was the woman who had written the first check that kept this school's science wing standing. I was the woman who had attended every fundraising gala for 11 years, who had served on the curriculum advisory board, who had personally called 3 donors when the capital campaign fell short of its goal in 2019. I was the woman who had built this school's scholarship endowment from a single $40,000 gift into a $4.2 million fund over the course of a decade. And Marcus had put me in row J. I adjusted the bouquet in my hand. The sunflowers were just beginning to open, yellow heads tilting toward the light. I said, "Donna, do not say anything to Daniel yet. Margaret. Please." She was quiet. I could hear the murmur of the gathering crowd behind her, the distant warm-up chords of the school orchestra. "All right," she said. I ended the call. I stood very still in the September heat, and let the information complete its full circuit through my body. The anger came first, a clean cold wave. Then grief, softer and older, the kind that arrives not at the wound itself, but at the distance between who someone was and who they became. Then something else. Something that had no good name, but felt like a door closing on the inside rather than the outside. I called my attorney, Carol Venn. Carol answered on the second ring, because Carol had been waiting for a call from me for 3 weeks, ever since I told her that Marcus had begun moving money in ways that suggested he was preparing for something he had not yet announced. "Today is the day," I said. A pause. Then Carol said, "Where are you?" "Outside Aldrich Preparatory Academy. My son's graduation." "He brought her. He put her in my seat." Silence again. Then Carol said, quietly and with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had spent 30 years watching powerful men miscalculate, "Did he know about the naming agreement?" "No," I said. "He never asked what my family money actually funded here. He only ever wanted to attend the events." Carol made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Then let him enjoy the ceremony. I put the phone in my blazer pocket. I picked up the sunflowers. I walked through the front entrance of Aldrich Preparatory Academy, the school whose library bore my mother's name on a bronze plaque beside the door, and I found my seat in row J. I sat down. I folded my hands in my lap. I watched the stage. I waited. Chapter 2. Marcus Hayes had not always been the kind of man who needed an audience to feel real. That was the version I kept trying to reconcile, the earlier man laid beneath the one who now required validation the way other people required oxygen. I met him at 26. He was managing partner of a small investment group that had just survived its second near collapse. I was working as a foundation director for my mother's charitable trust, the Whitmore Family Foundation, managing grants and donor relationships for a portfolio that was larger than it looked from the outside. Marcus came to a fundraising dinner because a colleague dragged him. He sat beside me by accident, or what felt like accident, and spent the entire evening asking questions that revealed he was paying close attention. He was handsome then, not flashy, but the kind of handsome that came from confidence and a good jaw and the habit of looking directly at people when they spoke. He laughed at the right moments. He listened with his whole body turned toward whoever was talking. He seemed genuinely curious about things that had nothing to do with his own advancement, which in the financial world was rarer than people admitted. We were married 3 years later. Daniel came the year after that. For the first decade, our marriage worked. Not perfectly. Nothing does. But Marcus was present, engaged, willing to repair after arguments, capable of tenderness in private even when he was difficult in public. He coached Daniel's soccer team for 2 years despite knowing nothing about soccer. He read books I recommended and actually discussed them, not to impress me, but because he wanted to know what I thought. He held my hand in the hospital when my mother was dying and did not check his phone for 7 hours. I do not know exactly when the shift began, because shifts rarely announce themselves. But I know that around year 15, something in Marcus began to require more mirrors. He joined clubs he didn't need. He started correcting people at dinner parties on subjects he had read about once. He began to speak of our life together in a way that subtly repositioned me as a backdrop, the quiet wife who managed the household and the family connections while Marcus built an empire. He was not entirely wrong that I was quiet. Quietness was something I had inherited from my mother, who believed that the most powerful people in a room were often the ones saying the least because they were doing the most watching. My mother had built the Whitmore Foundation from a $300,000 inheritance into a $90 million institution over 30 years. She held no press conferences. Her name appeared nowhere on the website except in the legal documents. She believed in what she called structural influence, the kind that outlasted headlines and personal reputations, the kind built into buildings and bylaws and endowment clauses. I had learned from her. Marcus had not learned that I had. He assumed my quietness was smallness. He assumed my deference in social situations was lack of opinion. He assumed my preference for staying home over attending his client dinners was evidence that I did not understand what those dinners required. He began to treat my invisibility as proof that I was invisible, which was the most expensive assumption he ever made. I did not correct him. Not because I was afraid. Because my mother had also taught me that explanations were most powerful when they were delivered through paper rather than speech. Priya House appeared in our life 3 years ago, as a junior consultant at Marcus's firm. I first heard her name when Daniel, home for spring break, mentioned that his father had been taking a lot of work calls on the porch. The porch was where Marcus went when he did not want me to hear. I had known about the porch calls for 2 years by then, but they had been about business, mostly, with the occasional conversation I could not quite identify. After Daniel's comment, I began to listen more carefully. Not dramatically. I did not install devices or hire investigators. I simply paid attention to the things that had always been available to pay attention to. Credit card statements. Travel dates. Hotel names cross-referenced against conference schedules. The smell of a particular cedar cologne on the collar of a shirt he hadn't worn to any occasion he'd told me about. The way his phone screen always tilted slightly away when I walked into a room. The way he stopped asking my opinion on things he once would have discussed with me, as though the consultation had moved elsewhere. By November of last year, I had a clear picture. By February, I had documentation. By April, I had spoken to Carol Venn for the first time. I did not tell Marcus I knew. I did not call Priya. I did not cry in the kitchen or confront him in the driveway. I continued making dinner on the nights he came home. I continued attending Daniel's virtual check-in calls from college. I continued sitting beside Marcus at the 2 school events we attended together, watching him shake hands with people who had no idea that the school under whose banner we were smiling existed in its current form largely because of money from my side of the family. I had been waiting for the right moment to become visible. Marcus chose it for me when he gave Priya my seat. Chapter 3. Daniel Hayes had grown into a young man of considerable gentleness and quiet intelligence, which Marcus often described as something that needed sharpening before the real world got hold of it. I understood this as Marcus's way of saying Daniel reminded him too much of me. He was graduating from Aldrich Preparatory with honors in environmental science and a fellowship to a university research program that he had applied for without telling either of us, wanting to secure it before he announced it, because Daniel had also inherited a version of the family preference for delivering truth through accomplished fact rather than projected intention. He had called me the week before graduation, ostensibly to confirm times, actually to ask whether everything was all right between his father and me. He had the radar of a child who grew up in a household where stability was performed more often than it was felt. "Everything is fine, Daniel," I said. "You sound like you're managing something," he said. "I am always managing something. That is what your grandmother built me to do." He was quiet. "Then, Mom. Whatever is happening, I just want you to know that today is about you as much as it is about me. You're the reason I'm here." I had to set the phone down for a moment after that. I did not tell him what Marcus had arranged. I did not want him walking across that stage carrying anything except pride. Inside the auditorium, Row J was in the center of the general seating, surrounded by parents I recognized from a decade of school events. Several of them looked at me with expressions that tried to be neutral and failed. Patricia Osei, a woman I had served with on the curriculum board for 4 years, slid over one seat without a word to put herself beside me. She did not say anything about the situation. She simply sat down and asked whether I had managed to find parking quickly, which was the kindest possible acknowledgement that she understood exactly what was happening and was choosing proximity over comment. I thanked her. From Row J, I could see the stage clearly. I could also see the reserved family section in the 3rd row from the front, where the gold-printed name cards designated the seats of graduating students' immediate family. Marcus sat in the center of that row in a dark charcoal suit. Beside him, in my seat, sat Priya House in a red dress with her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She held a program in both hands and periodically leaned close to Marcus to say something, their shoulders touching with the comfortable familiarity of people who had practiced closeness over a long period of time. I watched them for approximately 45 seconds. Then I opened my phone and sent 3 messages. The first was to Carol Venn. "The filing can proceed Monday." The second was to Robert Ashby, the executive director of the Aldrich Preparatory Endowment, who had my number saved under a category I had asked him to label simply as W for Whitmore. "We need the naming and contribution documentation ready for the board communication. Please send it to the headmaster before the reception begins." The third was to Donna, who was seated in the general section 4 rows behind me. "Sit tight. Don't let anyone move you." Donna texted back a single word. "Ready?" The orchestra finished its warm-up. The house lights dimmed. The processional music began, stately and slightly too loud for the acoustics of the room, and 83 graduating students filed in wearing navy gowns, and the particular expression of young people, who are trying to appear dignified while also scanning the audience for their families. Daniel found me in row J. I watched his eyes track from the reserved section, where Marcus sat with Priya, to the general crowd, searching. When his gaze landed on me, something crossed his face that I refused to name in that moment, because naming it would have made me cry, and I had decided before I walked in that I would not cry in this room today. I smiled at him. I held up the sunflowers so he could see them. He smiled back, slower than usual, sadder than a graduation smile should be, and I understood that he already knew. He was 22 years old and he had his grandmother's instincts. He had known. He was graduating anyway. He was walking across that stage with his spine straight and his chin up. He was mine. Chapter 4. The ceremony lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. I know because I watched it in a state of precise, focused attention that I had spent 26 years practicing without entirely knowing that's what I was doing. 3 speakers addressed the graduates. The headmaster, Dr. Lawrence Obi, spoke about integrity and institutional legacy. A parent representative spoke about resilience. A student valedictorian named Amara Peterson spoke about the difference between the world you inherit and the world you build, which was so precisely relevant to my own morning that I felt briefly, as though the universe had written her speech with specific intent. Marcus did not look at row J once during the ceremony. Either he did not know where I was sitting, or he had decided that whatever explanation he planned to offer me later would be easier to construct if he did not have to meet my eyes in the interim. Both possibilities told me the same thing about the man I had married. He was better at avoiding discomfort than at addressing it. Priya looked at her phone twice during the ceremony, which I recorded mentally not out of petty surveillance, but because behavior under observation reveals character in ways rehearsed behavior cannot. When Daniel's name was called, I stood in row J and I clapped until my palms hurt. Patricia Osei stood beside me. Donna stood behind me. 3 other parents in the immediate vicinity, who had worked with me on various school committees over the years, stood without any signal from anyone, simply because they had seen me come in alone with sunflowers, and they understood something about what that meant. Daniel crossed the stage. He shook Dr. Obi's hand. He accepted his diploma. He looked directly at me in row J with the kind of expression that does not belong in ceremony footage, but belongs in the place between mothers and sons where words are too slow. I put my hand over my heart. He nodded once. Then he smiled, the real one, the one that was pure Daniel, the one that had been living in his face since he was 4 with a coffee can full of sunflower seeds. He walked off the stage. I sat down. Across the auditorium, Priya leaned into Marcus and said something close to his ear. He reached over and squeezed her hand in a gesture so ordinary and domestic that it briefly stopped my breathing, not because I wanted his hand, but because I remembered a time when ordinary and domestic had felt like enough. When it had felt like everything. That time was gone. I had mourned it slowly over 6 months of documentation and careful silence, and what remained now was not grief but clarity. Clarity was colder than grief and considerably more useful. After the final benediction, the auditorium began to empty into the adjoining reception hall where tables had been set with white linens, champagne, and the particular spread of catered food that signals institutional celebration. I took my time standing. I smoothed my blazer. I adjusted the sunflowers under my arm. My phone buzzed. Robert Ashby. Documentation sent to Dr. Obi and the board chair, per your instruction. I also took the liberty of alerting the communications director, as you asked last week. Everything is in place. I typed back, thank you, Robert. I walked into the reception. Chapter 5. Marcus found me near the entrance of the reception hall before I had taken 6 steps inside. He moved with the particular velocity of a man who has been rehearsing an explanation since parking and has finally reached his moment. His expression had been arranged into something between apology and justification, which was the emotional configuration he defaulted to when he had done something indefensible, and needed to transform it into a misunderstanding before anyone else defined it first. Margaret. He touched my elbow. I did not step back. I simply looked at his hand until he removed it. There was a confusion with the seating, he said. His voice was low, controlled, the voice he used in negotiations. The school made an error on the family section arrangement. I should have caught it earlier. The school printed my name on the card, I said. His jaw moved. I asked them to make an adjustment. You asked them to seat your mistress in my place at our son's graduation. He glanced around. 2 couples within earshot were performing a careful study of the canapé table. Keep your voice down. I have not raised it. That was true. My voice was perfectly level. It had been level all morning and intended to remain that way, because I had learned from my mother that the most dangerous thing a woman could do in a room full of powerful people was sound exactly as calm as the most powerful person there. We will discuss this privately, Marcus said. Tonight. We will discuss things through our attorneys, I said. Carol Venn has already been retained. You should reach out to your representation today. The word attorneys landed on him with the weight of something he had not expected yet. His eyes changed. You're not serious. I have been serious for 6 months, Marcus. You simply weren't paying attention. He looked past me, locating Priya somewhere deeper in the reception. Then he looked back. You are going to make a scene at your son's graduation. I came to see my son graduate, I said. I have been doing that, quietly, from row J, where you placed me. The scene, Marcus, is already assembled. You built it. He opened his mouth. Then Priya appeared beside him, her hand sliding onto his arm with the reflexive ease of a habit. She looked at me with the expression of a woman who has been coached on this encounter, and is now discovering that the coaching was based on incomplete information. You must be Margaret, she said. Not Eleanor, as in the story. Not a tragic wife. Margaret. My full name, in her mouth, shaped into something she intended to sound like acknowledgement, but landed closer to dismissal. I am, I said. She offered a small, composed smile. I know this is awkward. I want you to know there are no hard feelings on my end. I looked at her. I looked at her the way my mother had taught me to look at people who misunderstood the room they were standing in, not with anger, not with contempt, but with the patient attention of someone reading a map error before the car goes off the road. Priya, I said, gently. Do you know what this school is? She blinked. It's a preparatory academy. Do you know how it was funded? Marcus's body went very still beside her. The science wing, I continued, was built in 2014 through a capital gift from the Whitmore Family Foundation. The library was established in 2009 and named for my mother, Eleanor Margaret Whitmore, whose contribution of $1.8 million at the time was the largest single gift in the school's history. The scholarship endowment, which now funds 12 students annually, was seeded by our family and has been managed through annual contributions from my foundation account for the past 11 years. I paused. The naming agreement on the auditorium, I said, where my son just graduated, where you sat in my seat, takes effect on Monday. Priya's smile had become complicated. Marcus was not breathing in a way that was visible to anyone but me. The building will carry my mother's full name, I said. The dedication ceremony is in November. I hope the engraving will be finished by then. It tends to take longer than the contractor's promise. I turned toward the room. Excuse me, I said. I need to find my son. Chapter 6. Daniel was near the far windows with 3 of his closest friends, still in his gown, holding a plate of food he hadn't started eating because he kept scanning the room. When he saw me crossing toward him, his whole face rearranged itself. He met me halfway. He was 6 feet now, taller than his father by an inch, with my mother's grey eyes and a way of standing that had always reminded me of someone who was listening to something most people couldn't hear. He took the sunflowers before I could hand them to him. He pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than graduation hugs are supposed to last, one arm around my shoulders, the other pressing the bouquet gently to my back, as if the flowers were also being comforted. "I saw where you were sitting," he said into my hair. "I know. Mom. Today is yours," I said. "We are not spending 1 second of it on that." He pulled back. He looked at my face carefully with those grey eyes. "Did you say something to him?" "A few words." He stuttered me. Daniel had always been able to tell when I was managing a situation rather than surviving one. It was a distinction his grandmother had taught him to identify, because surviving made you reactive and managing made you accurate. "The auditorium thing," he said slowly. "The naming agreement. Is that Monday?" I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Grandma would have loved this." "She would have been deeply satisfied," I agreed. "And then she would have said we were spending too much time discussing it, and suggested we find the dessert table." Daniel laughed. It was the Real laugh, sudden and full, the one that had always made whatever room it occupied feel immediately warmer. Several of his friends looked over and smiled without knowing why, the way people involuntarily respond to genuine joy. His girlfriend, Sophia, appeared at his elbow with 2 plates and the practical efficiency of a young woman who understood that emotional moments were better sustained when people had eaten. She handed one to Daniel and offered me the other with a smile that suggested she had been briefed on the morning and had formed her own conclusions. "Congratulations, Margaret," she said. "On everything." I accepted the plate. I ate. I talked to Daniel's friends about their plans, their programs, the research fellowship he had won, the gap that had opened in the world for their generation to either widen or begin to close. I talked about my mother, who they had never met, but who existed in the building around them in ways they had not known until approximately 30 minutes ago. I did not look at Marcus's side of the room. Not because I was afraid to. Because he had already become, with the precision of a single conversation, less important to the day than the food on the canapé table. He existed in the room at the level of background. He had curated his own irrelevance by misunderstanding whose hands were holding the walls up. Chapter 7. The headmaster found me near the end of the reception, as I had known he would. Dr. Lawrence Obi was a careful man with a methodical mind, the kind of administrator who built institutions rather than merely ran them, and who understood the difference between donors who wanted recognition and donors who wanted results. We had worked together for 8 years. He knew my mother's name because he had chosen it for the library himself, saying at the time that the women who built things quietly deserved the permanence that public names provided. "Margaret," he said, extending his hand with the warmth of someone who is also doing careful math in his head. "Lawrence," I said. "I received the documentation from Robert this morning." He chose his words with the precision of a man who has been navigating the overlap of institutional and personal for too long to be careless with either. "I want to say, on behalf of the school, that your family's generosity has been foundational. In the most literal sense of that word. My mother believed in the institution," I said. "I believed in what the institution could become." He nodded. His eyes moved briefly across the room in the direction of where Marcus stood with Priya and 2 other couples who had arranged themselves into the geometry of people trying to appear unconcerned while being extremely concerned. "The dedication ceremony in November," he said. "We are planning something appropriate." "Small," I said. My mother would have wanted something small. "Of course." He paused. I should also mention that I was not aware of the seating arrangement that was made in the family section. "I have spoken to the events coordinator." "It will not," he stopped. The communication was not routed through our standard process. I understood what he was telling me without him saying it plainly. Marcus had made the seating arrangement through a channel that bypassed the usual coordination, which meant he had done it deliberately and quietly, counting on it being too late for me to object by the time I arrived. "It's all right, Lawrence," I said. "It is not," he said quietly. "But I appreciate your grace." I thanked him. He moved away. Carol then texted as I was gathering my things to leave. Financial disclosure filed. Preservation order on joint accounts effective 9 a.m. Monday. You should know he made 2 wire transfers last Thursday. We have them. I read the message twice. Then I put the phone in my blazer pocket. Marcus had been moving money. Of course he had. He had been watching me be quiet for 26 years, and had concluded that quiet meant unaware. It was the same conclusion Priya had drawn when she smiled and said there were no hard feelings on her end. The same conclusion that generated a gold-printed name card moved from one chair to another, as though a woman's designated place could be relocated without consequence. I thought about my mother, who spent her entire professional life being moved. Who was seated at the edge of tables, not the head. Whose name appeared on thank you notes, but not press releases. Who had watched men take credit for her thinking with such consistent regularity that she eventually stopped putting her thinking anywhere they could reach it, and started putting it in buildings instead. I came from that. I was made of that particular patience. The patience that was not suffering but preparation. The patience that did not wait to be rescued, but waited to become undeniable. I found Daniel one last time before I left. I put my hands on either side of his face the way I had done since he was small, and he let me even though he was 22 and 6 feet tall, and had just accepted a research fellowship and graduated with honors. You are going to be extraordinary, I said. I learned from the best, he said. I kissed his forehead. I walked out through the front entrance of Aldrich Preparatory Academy. The bronze plaque beside the library door caught the afternoon light as I passed. Eleanor Margaret Whitmore Memorial Library. Established 2009. My mother's name, in permanent letters, on a building that existed because she had believed that what you built outlasted what anyone said about you. I touched the edge of the plaque with 2 fingers. Then I walked to my car, drove home, and began building what came next. Chapter 8. Marcus arrived at the house at 9:30 that evening. He had his key, but he rang the doorbell first, which told me he had already begun to recalibrate. Men who believe they own a space do not ring the bell. He rang it because the morning had introduced doubt, and doubt, in Marcus, had always expressed itself through small formal gestures that compensated for the informality of what he had done. I opened the door. I did not open it wide. He looked tired in the way that guilt produced, not the clean exhaustion of effort, but the depleting tiredness of sustained performance. His jacket was off, his shirt slightly wrinkled, his silver hair less composed than it had been in the auditorium. We need to talk, he said. You should have your attorney present for any conversation about the marriage, I said. He exhaled through his nose. Margaret, for God's sake. We have been married for 26 years. Yes, I said. I know. He stared at me. Are you really doing this? Tonight? After Daniel's graduation. You chose the timing when you placed Priya in my seat. I kept my voice level and my hand on the edge of the door. I am not extending the performance into the evening. It wasn't a performance. Marcus. His name in my mouth, quiet and final. I have documentation. Transfers, messages, hotel records, the apartment in the River District. Carol has everything. Your attorney will receive a full disclosure packet by Tuesday. His face shifted through several things in quick succession. Anger, calculation, and beneath both, the particular fear of a man who had believed himself well hidden, discovering that the hiding had been observed the entire time. The apartment, he said, and then stopped. River District, I confirmed. 12 months of payments from the secondary account you opened in February of last year. The account you told me was a client retainer vehicle. He put one hand against the door frame. The gesture was meant to look casual. It looked like someone steadying himself on a moving surface. What do you want? He asked. His voice had lost its negotiating quality. It was bare now, stripped of the register he kept for boardrooms and confrontations he expected to win. A fair settlement, I said. Nothing punitive. I am not interested in destruction, Marcus. I am interested in accuracy. Accuracy, he repeated, as though the word confused him. I want what is mine correctly identified and returned, I said. The Whitmore Foundation assets have never been marital property. The accounts I manage as trustee have never been joint. The family endowments, the school commitments, the property holdings through my mother's trust. None of it is yours regardless of what you may have assumed over 26 years of convenient proximity to it. He was very still. And the transfers from Thursday, I said. Those will need to be reversed. How do you? Carol has many resources. He looked at me for a long time. In that look, I could see him recataloguing the last 26 years with this information inserted into the archive, the way a researcher discovers a misfiled document and has to reread everything that cited it. All the dinners where I sat quietly while he explained the financial world to other men. All the school events where he accepted handshakes for his involvement in an institution he had never funded. All the times he described me to colleagues as supportive and low-key, which were words men used for women whose capabilities they had not investigated. I didn't know, he said finally. Not defensively. Just as a fact. I know you didn't. Why didn't you tell me? I thought about my mother. I thought about the bronze plaque and the library, and the endowment that had been growing quietly for 11 years while Marcus attended the galas and accepted the handshakes. I thought about the specific quality of invisibility that had always been available to women who preferred to be underestimated, the invisibility that looked like passivity until the moment it became a structure. Because, I said, you never asked who you were married to. You decided, early on, and you stopped asking. He had nothing to say to that. The honesty of it left no surface to push against. Get an attorney, I said. A good one. I closed the door. I stood in the front hallway for a moment, listening to the house. The ticking of the clock in the study. The distant sound of the neighbor's dog. The way a 26-year marriage sounded in its last evening, ordinary and permanent and gone. I walked to the kitchen. I put the kettle on. I was not happy. I want to be clear about that, because women who hold their ground in stories like this are so often described as triumphant, as though precision and pain are mutually exclusive. I was not happy. I was correct, which is a different thing entirely and considerably lonelier in the immediate hours. But I was also, for the first time in years, exactly the size of my actual life. That was something. Chapter 9. The divorce process was not clean, because they never are. Marcus retained a well-regarded attorney named Philip Garrett, who specialized in high-asset dissolutions, and arrived at the first mediation session with the confident posture of a man who has researched his opponent and found the research reassuring. It was the kind of confidence that lasted approximately until Carol then placed the first exhibit on the conference room table. The Whitmore Family Foundation Trust Documents. Dated 1987. Eleanor Margaret Whitmore, founder and controlling trustee. Margaret Eleanor Whitmore Hayes, successor trustee upon founder's death, effective as of 2016. Philip Garrett reviewed the first page. Then he reviewed it again. Marcus sat across from me in a grey suit, with his hands flat on the table in the posture of a man trying to look stable. He did not look at me directly for the first 40 minutes. That was new. In 26 years of marriage, Marcus had rarely avoided my eyes. He had rarely needed to, because for most of those years, what he saw when he looked at me had confirmed the story he was telling himself about our relative positions. Carol walked Philip through the foundation assets methodically. The trust had been established before the marriage. No commingling had occurred. My role as trustee carried fiduciary obligations that were legally distinct from marital obligations, meaning that the foundation's resources had never been marital property regardless of proximity or assumption. The school endowment. The library. The auditorium naming agreement. Philip's confidence adjusted in degrees. The wire transfers from the Thursday before graduation were addressed directly. Marcus had moved $340,000 from a joint investment account to a private vehicle. The account, Carol noted, had been funded in part by dividends from a partnership that included Whitmore Foundation co-investments. The provenance was traceable and would be traced. Marcus looked at his attorney. Philip looked at his notepad. "We can discuss reversal," Philip said, which was attorney language for "we are not going to fight about this particular thing." Priya Halse's name did not appear in the mediation documents. I had made that decision deliberately, because incorporating her name would have made the dissolution about the affair rather than about the assets, and affairs were emotional and assets were mathematical. And I had always been better with mathematics. She existed in the proceedings the way all such figures exist, as a destination Marcus had been traveling toward while believing the infrastructure of his departure was someone else's to manage. He had been wrong about that. The final settlement took 4 months to reach. Marcus kept his firm, his personal accounts, and the home we had shared, which he later sold because he told Daniel he found it difficult to be in a house that carried so much of my presence. I kept the Whitmore Foundation assets, the trust properties, the school endowments, and a clear-eyed accounting of everything I had contributed to the life we'd built, most of which had been invisible to Marcus not because I had hidden it from him, but because he had never thought to ask about the foundation a woman was laying while he attended to the facade. We divided the remaining joint assets with the mechanical thoroughness of two people who had once been close and were now primarily interested in accuracy. The day I signed the final decree, Carol met me outside the courthouse with coffee she had brought from the place I liked. We stood on the courthouse steps in October light, the same September heat long gone now, the city moving around us with its ordinary momentum. "How are you?" she asked. "Accurate," I said. She smiled. "Your mother would approve." Chapter 10. The auditorium dedication ceremony took place on a Friday in mid-November. I had asked for small, and Dr. Obi had honored that request in the way that institutional people honored requests from donors who did not need to be flattered, which meant the ceremony was intimate and genuine rather than theatrical. Approximately 60 people attended. Board members, faculty, several long-serving staff whom my mother had met over the years and remembered by name, because Eleanor Whitmore had made a practice of learning the names of the people who maintained the places she funded. Daniel was there, in a dark jacket, standing in the third row beside Sophia, with his arm around her shoulders. Donna came. Patricia Osei came. Carol sent flowers. Marcus did not attend, which was correct. The auditorium had nothing to do with him. Dr. Obi spoke about my mother first, about the specific quality of her investment in the school, which had always been about students rather than recognition. He spoke about the scholarship recipients over the years, 3 of whom were in the room, now adults with careers that had been made possible by a fund that a quiet woman had built over a decade through consistent, patient contribution. Then he spoke about the naming agreement, and about the particular significance of dedicating a space where hundreds of young people would be celebrated in the years to come to a woman who had believed, above all other things, that what you built for other people's futures was the most permanent thing you could put your name on. He asked me to say a few words. I stood at the small podium at the front of the auditorium, the same stage where Daniel had crossed 2 months earlier, the same hall where I had sat in row J while my name card occupied a different chair. I thought about what to say for a long moment. "My mother never wanted a plaque," I began. "She specifically told me, several times, that she did not need her name on anything to know that she had built it. She said that women who required their names on walls were women who did not trust that the work would speak." I paused. She was, in this specific area, slightly wrong. Not about the walls, but about the speaking. A soft laugh moved through the room. "Walls do not speak," I continued. "Buildings do not speak. Endowments do not stand up and tell the story of how they got there. That is what we have to do. That is what I am doing now, because I spent too many years being quiet in rooms where I should have been speaking, and I would like the students who walk through this building for the next 50 years to know exactly who built it and why." I looked at Daniel. He had his grandmother's eyes, and in that moment he was using them the way she had, wide open and entirely still, the way you look at something you are trying to hold. My mother built things, because she believed the future deserved places to become itself, I said. She did not build them for recognition. She built them because she had looked carefully at the world and identified what was missing, and she had the resources and the patience to provide it, and she did, quietly, over 40 years, while people assumed she was simply the widow in the wool cardigan, who attended a lot of school events. Another laugh, warmer. I hope, I said, that every student who receives a scholarship from this endowment, and every student who graduates in this hall, understands that the woman whose name is on this building was not famous. She was not powerful in any way that would have shown up on a list. She simply paid close attention to what mattered and built accordingly. And she taught me to do the same. I stepped back. The applause was not thunderous. It was the right size. It filled the room and then settled, and in the quiet that followed, something true had been said aloud and received. Chapter 11. I moved into a smaller apartment 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Not because I couldn't have stayed in a property larger than I needed. I had access to a dozen of them. But I had spent 26 years in rooms calibrated to someone else's idea of the size my life should be, and I wanted, for the first time, to live only in as much space as I actually used. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in the historic quarter, with tall windows and afternoon light, and a kitchen that was precisely the right size for someone who cooked for pleasure rather than occasion. I put my mother's photograph on the desk in the study. I put a coffee can on the windowsill in the kitchen and planted sunflower seeds in it, because Daniel had thought of it first when he was 4 years old, and it had always seemed to me like a reasonable approach to any new beginning. Daniel called twice a week from his research program. He talked about the project, about Sophia, about the specific beauty of the Pacific coastline where the university Saturday. Occasionally he asked careful questions about Marcus that I answered honestly and briefly, because Daniel deserved both honesty and the protection of brevity from his parents' adult failures. Marcus had moved into a rental property in the city. There was no public information about Priya, and I did not seek any, because the details of how people rearranged their lives after they had unmade their former ones were their own business, as long as those details did not intersect with mine. Carol sent a brief message in January. Everything has been reversed and confirmed. The foundations are clean. You're clear. I replied, thank you for everything. She replied, it was never in doubt. I thought about that for a while. It was never in doubt, from Carol's vantage point, because Carol had seen the documents before the ceremony, before the reception, before the conversation in the doorway. She had seen the architecture before the drama, and what she had seen was unambiguous. I had built things. I owned them. I had not been in doubt. It was I who had doubted. Not about the assets. About the cost. Leaving a 26-year marriage, even a marriage that had become a slow performance of its former self, cost something real. Not only legally, not only structurally. There was the loss of the person Marcus had been before he confused access with identity. There was the loss of the particular companionship that long marriages produced even in their diminished late forms, the shorthand, the shared history, the way another person's presence in a house made it sound different from the way a house sounded alone. I was honest about that loss. I did not hurry past it in the direction of resolution, because resolution is where stories end and living is considerably less organized than that. I sat with the loss the way my mother had taught me to sit with difficult things. Long enough to know it. Not so long that it made decisions for me. The sunflowers on the kitchen windowsill grew slowly in November light. Chapter 12. 6 months after the graduation, I was invited to speak at the annual gathering of the Whitmore Foundation scholarship recipients, something I had done every year since my mother's death, but that felt different now for reasons I was still naming. The gathering took place in the Foundation's event room, a clean-lined space with large windows and a long table where past recipients gathered with their families to mark whatever the year had held and to meet the students newly entering the program. There were 15 of them this year, ranging from 16 to 22, all attending schools whose tuition the endowment covered and whose futures my mother had elected to fund before she ever knew their names. I sat at the edge of the table rather than the head, which is where I preferred to be, where you could see everyone's face. I told them about my mother. I told them about the coffee can and the sunflower seeds, and what it meant to build things that outlasted your ability to defend them personally. I told them that the endowment they were part of had begun as a single gift from a woman who had been underestimated her entire professional life, and who had responded to that underestimation not with anger, but with patience and paper and 30 years of compound interest. A girl named Kwame, who was 17 and sharp-eyed and clearly bored by anything that wasn't directly useful, raised her hand and asked what I had personally gotten out of doing this for 20 years. I considered the question seriously. I got to be the person my mother thought I was before I knew who that was. Kwame seemed to find this acceptable. After the gathering, Daniel called. He was in the parking lot of his research facility, having just received confirmation that his fellowship was being extended. His voice sounded like sunflowers looked, open and unhesitating and aimed at the light. "Mom," he said. "I want you to know something." "Tell me." "That morning. The graduation. I knew before I walked across the stage that you were in row J. I saw where they had you sitting, and I almost said something. I almost stopped. I was quiet. I didn't," he said. "Because I thought, she built this place. She doesn't need the right chair. She doesn't need anyone's permission to be the most important person in that room." I had to set the phone down for a moment. The same as I had 6 months ago, for the same reason, but also for entirely different ones. When I picked it back up, I said, "Your grandmother taught me that." "I know," he said. "And you taught me." That was the inheritance that mattered most. Not the buildings, not the endowments, not the foundation accounts and trust documents and legally unimpeachable asset schedules that Carol had assembled with such satisfying precision. Those were instruments. The inheritance that mattered was the way of seeing. The understanding that quiet was not absence. That watching was not passivity. That the patience to build something correctly, regardless of whether anyone was observing you build it, was a form of power so deep it barely needed defending because it was structural, foundational, permanent. It was in the walls. It had always been in the walls. Marcus could have put Priya in every seat in that auditorium, and it would not have changed whose name was going on the building. He could have moved every chair in the room and the foundation would have remained what it was, because foundations did not depend on acknowledgement. They depended on construction. My mother had understood that. I had learned it. And on a rainy November afternoon in a 4th-floor apartment, with a coffee can on the kitchen windowsill, an afternoon light on a desk where my mother's photograph watched everything in the still, sharp-eyed way she had always watched things, I was teaching it forward. Chapter 13. The spring after the graduation brought unexpected things, the way spring always does when you have finally stopped bracing against winter. Robert Ashby asked if I would consider joining the Aldrich Preparatory Board formally. Not in the advisory capacity I had held for years, operating at a slight remove with a degree of deliberate invisibility, but as a full voting board member, with the title and the presence and the chair that entitled implied. I sat with the question for 3 days. My mother had declined board membership at every institution she funded. She had believed that official positions created obligations to manage appearances that conflicted with the more honest obligation to manage outcomes. She had preferred the clarity of the donor relationship, where her interest was transparent and her authority was limited to what she chose to fund and what she chose to withdraw. I had held that position because I trusted it. But I was also not my mother. I was the next iteration, shaped by her but arriving in a different moment, and the moment I was arriving in suggested that some of the invisibility that had served my mother as strategy had been adopted by me in ways that sometimes looked less like strategy and more like permission. Permission for people who should have known better to not know better. I called Daniel. I asked his opinion in the way I had begun asking his opinion on things since he became an adult, not because I would necessarily follow the opinion, but because he had inherited the precise quality of observation I most trusted, and it was useful to hear it in his voice. "Take the seat," he said, without pausing. "Take the actual seat." I thanked him. I called Robert Ashby and said yes. The first board meeting I attended in full capacity was in April, in a conference room, with a view of the school's east courtyard, where the science wing my mother had funded stood in clean brick lines against the spring sky. I sat at the table. Not at the edge. At the table, with my name on the name card in front of me, printed clearly and without amendment. Dr. Obi, who had known me in various capacities for 8 years, looked at my name card, and then at me and smiled with the expression of a man who had waited some time for something to be correctly located. "Welcome," he said. "Formally." "Thank you," I said. "Formally." We went through the agenda. I asked the questions I had always asked but previously routed through informal channels, directly now, in the meeting, at the table, on the record. The board listened. This, too, was something my mother might have been slightly wrong about. Not the part about building things. That was correct and remained correct. But the part about whether the building needed to be witnessed. Whether the names needed to be on the walls. I thought, yes. Sometimes they did. Not for vanity. For instruction. So that the students who walked through those halls understood that someone had chosen them. Had built toward them specifically. Had put a name on the building not to be remembered but to be believed, because women who built things without names were women whose building could be mistaken for accident, and accidents could be overwritten, but names on walls in permanent letters were considerably harder to revise. My mother had gotten the buildings right. I was making sure the lesson was legible. Chapter 14. Priya House left Marcus 10 months after the graduation. I learned this through Donna, who learned it through the kind of lateral social network that carries information in cities without anyone explicitly deciding to transmit it. I received the information on a Tuesday afternoon in the tone that such information is usually delivered, gently, with the pause that says the person telling you is not sure whether you will feel vindicated or saddened. I felt neither, which surprised me slightly and then did not. Marcus was 55 by then, managing his firm in a reduced capacity, living in a rented property, learning the particular arithmetic of a life without the structural support of someone else's quietly enormous resources. Priya had been 31 and full of the certainty that comes from having been told you were chosen. The thing about being chosen by someone who chose against his own foundations was that the choice was never really about you. It was about the chooser's need to believe he was operating independently. And when the independence revealed itself to be borrowed at every level, the choosing lost its meaning. She was not a villain. I had never been interested in casting her as one, because villains were assigned responsibility that should have belonged to Marcus, and Marcus was already carrying his portion. Priya had done what people did when they were offered something that seemed worth the cost of ignoring what it was built on. She had taken it. The cost had become apparent. She had left. I did not reach out to Marcus when I heard. It was not my comfort to offer. I did send Daniel a message that evening, unrelated to Marcus, about the fellowship extension and the research direction he'd described in our last call, because Daniel remained the part of the 26 years that was entirely and unconditionally worth every moment of building. He replied with a photograph of the Pacific coastline at sunset, blue and immense and completely unbothered by human arrangements, and added, "Thinking of you and Grandma tonight. Tell her I said thank you." I looked at my mother's photograph on the desk. "He says thank you," I said. Her expression in the photograph was the one she wore when something had turned out exactly as she had patiently expected it to. Not smug. Not surprised. Simply confirmed. I put the kettle on. Chapter 15. 2 years after the graduation, on a September morning when the light had the particular quality of early autumn, I walked through the front entrance of Aldrich Preparatory Academy for a board meeting and passed the bronze plaque beside the library door. I did not touch it this time. I simply read it as I passed. Eleanor Margaret Whitmore Memorial Library. Established 2009. Inside, the new plaque on the auditorium wall had been in place since November. Same bronze, same measured lettering, same quiet authority that my mother had always preferred over volume. Eleanor Margaret Whitmore Auditorium. Dedicated to the future of every student who walked through these doors. I stood in the corridor outside the auditorium for a moment before the meeting began. Through the tall doors I could hear a group of students rehearsing something, the sound of chairs on a stage floor, a teacher's voice counting rhythm, the warm-up scales of a small orchestra preparing for some occasion still ahead of it. The school was full of future. That was what buildings were for. Not to commemorate what had already happened, but to make room for what hadn't happened yet. I thought about Row J. I thought about a gold-printed name card moved from one seat to another by a man who had assumed the ease of the gesture proved his authority to make it. I thought about what it had felt like to sit there, calm and furious and entirely clear about what I was doing and why. It had not felt like winning. I want to be careful about that, because winning was the word people reached for, and it was not wrong exactly, but it was not precise. What it had felt like was alignment. The alignment of who I actually was with how I was actually being seen, for possibly the first time in a very long time, by the room that contained me. A woman could be moved from her designated seat and placed in row J. She could be handed a trash bag and told to take only what she had personally earned. She could be described as sweet when she was married and convenient when she was inconvenient and gone when she had finally gone. None of those relocations would move what she had actually built, because what she had actually built was in the walls. In the bylaws. In the endowment account with compound interest accumulating for 11 years. In the naming agreements and the bronze plaques and the scholarship students who had attended schools they could not have attended without someone choosing to fund them before she knew their names. A woman who built things did not need the right chair to be the most important person in the room. She needed, perhaps, to stop giving away the right chair so easily. She needed, perhaps, to sit in it when she had earned it. I straightened my jacket. I walked into the board meeting. I sat down. Subscribe for more stories about betrayal, hidden strength, and the quiet moment a woman finally takes her seat.